Thank you very much, Chris. It's a terrific honor to be here in Bahrain. This is my first visit. I have not been to the Middle East in a couple of years, and I'm actually quite eager at lunch and other places to learn from you as well. So the title is not exactly The Death of Liberal Democracy.
No, I realize that.
But I do think that we are in an extraordinarily dangerous time for what has been called the liberal international order. Liberal international order is an order that was established after 1945. It consists of two parts. There is an economic component, which is the whole system of rules-based trade and investment that's characterized our globalized world, underpinned by institutions like the WTO, like the European Union, by a host of other economic agreements that make the movement of goods, services, investment across national borders possible. The political component of that order is the series of alliances largely centered on the United States, in Europe, in Asia, and other parts of the world that has been responsible for international security. And the two parts, the economic and the political, are necessary complements to one another. Now, this international order, this liberal international order, has actually worked exactly as advertised. Between 1970 and the crisis in 2008, the output of the world economy quintupled, increased by 400%. And so it has been responsible for an enormous increase in the well-being of human beings. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's created new middle classes in many emerging market economies, and so forth. However, I think, as we are well aware from recent events, the distributional consequences of this globalization have not been even, and in particular, the rise of middle classes in places like India and China has often come at the expense of middle classes in the developed world, in places like the United States and in Western Europe. And I think that's the general background condition to the backlash that we've been seeing, represented by the events like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump in the United States. So I'm going to speak a little bit in greater detail about both America and about Europe, and then some analogs to what's been going on in Europe and the United States. And then I'll end up on the question of what this means for this region and for, in particular, American foreign policy. So let me begin with the United States. I must say that as an American, I find the past year to be one of the most bizarre and upsetting that I have lived through, I would say really in my entire adult experience. There are a couple of important background conditions for understanding what happened that led to the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump won the American election in November really because of one actually fairly narrow set of circumstances. He won in the electoral, as you're probably aware, he lost the popular vote by about 2.8 million votes. He won in the Electoral College for one reason. There are three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that had traditionally been Democratic states. In fact, they had voted so reliably for Democratic candidates in recent decades that Hillary Clinton did not even bother to campaign in Wisconsin, and yet they all flipped over and voted for Trump by an actually very small margin. It was only about 110,000 voters in those three states. If 55,000 of them had voted the other way, then Hillary Clinton would be the president today. This is significant because these are all northern industrialized states, and the voters that flipped were all unionized workers, or largely unionized workers, that had been one of the core constituencies of the Democratic Party ever since the 1930s, ever since the New Deal. And it's exactly these kinds of voters that were hit the most hard, the heaviest by deindustrialization. And I think that one thing that the election has made clear to a lot of us is that the social crisis that has been created as a result of these different trends, globalization, immigration, but above all technology, has really led to a broad social crisis in this group of people. So, for example, American life expectancy for males, adult males, has actually declined over the past decade. This is absolutely unprecedented. Every other OECD country has seen an increase in male life expectancy, except for the United States. The reason for this is drug abuse, because especially within this working class demographic, in the year 2015, 650,000 Americans died of heroin overdoses, which was sufficient, that in itself was sufficient to lower overall life expectancy. The rate of family breakdown in this group is approaching about 60%. 60% of children are growing up in single-parent families. And so in many respects, what happened to the African-American community back in the 1980s with a similar set of economic job loss then leading to a broader social collapse has been taking place in working-class white communities in the United States. And that, I think, is really the core of the broadly recognized phenomenon of growing inequality, the 1% versus the 99%. This is a group that has not been well served by either political party. The Republicans have been dominated by the Chamber of Commerce, by corporate America, which is represented by the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. They are pro-globalization, pro-technological change, and pro-immigration. Their working class base does not believe in these things, and for the last couple of generations has been voting for Republican candidates, despite the fact that this set of policies has not served the interests of this group. And Donald Trump figured this out. He was a brilliant political entrepreneur who understood that there was an opening that the Republican Party was not filling. The Democrats were not doing much better. The Democratic Party in recent years has become the party of identity politics. And so the way that Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton tried to put together an electoral victory was appealing to African Americans, to women, to the LGBT community, to environmentalists, to all of these constituent groups within the Democratic Party, trying to satisfy each one. The one identity group that they did not succeed in reaching was that group of white working class voters that for decades had been the real base of the left-wing party in the United States. And it was that failure, I think, that accounts for the rise of really what is the first populist nationalist president that we have ever seen in this country. The second important background condition to the election is government dysfunction. So there's a lot of talk about populism. The problem, and the reason, one of the reasons I don't like the word populism very much is that it assumes that the elites know what they're doing, that the elites have very wise policies that they've been following, and it's just that ordinary people are too uneducated or ignorant to really understand why that was all good for them. In many ways, that has not been the story of the past decade. The elites in the United States succeeded in engineering the policy failures that led to the 2008 subprime crisis. But in a broader way, the American political system has not been working terribly well. This is a problem that I identified in my last book as vetocracy, that is to say, ruled by veto. The American system is built on checks and balances. The American political system, in order to avoid overly centralized, powerful government, distributes power to a separately elected president, powerful upper house of Congress, to states and localities. It has a very powerful judiciary that can overturn legislation. To a much greater extent than parliamentary democracies in Europe, the United States government is in a sense institutionally primed not to be able to make rapid decisions. If you couple that with the extraordinary degree of political polarization in the United States between Republicans and Democrats, and if you couple that also with the rise of very powerful and well-organized interest groups, you get vetocracy. You get a government that over the last 20 years has not been able to pass a budget under what in Congress is called regular order. That is to say, an orderly budget process that looks ahead in the medium term and lays down a long-term fiscal strategy. Rather, the government has been shut down completely on a couple of occasions in recent years because Republicans and Democrats simply couldn't decide on it. And it means that things that should receive a consensus approval in our system have not been able to be accomplished. So it's both of these things. It's the rise of inequality, and it is the perception that powerful interest groups have captured important parts of the American government that I think serve as the background conditions explaining the rise of Trump. There's a further issue as well. Not everybody that voted for Donald Trump was a displaced worker in a manufacturing industry. A lot of them were in fact quite well-to-do, middle-class suburbanites, people living in fairly good conditions. The identity question, however, has risen to the forefront in the United States. This started on the left with the kind of Democratic Party identity politics that I talked about, but it's in a way provoked its opposite. A lot of these white workers say to themselves, here are all these women and African Americans getting ahead of online ahead of me. We're the only group, we white working class people are the only group that the government actually doesn't care about. And what about us? And that's why I think you've seen the rise of what's been labeled white nationalism in the United States. Some of it is pretty nasty and unpleasant, but that is also, I think, what's driven a lot of people to vote for Trump. So this was the big opportunity that had been waiting ever since the financial crisis in 2008, whose significance I think we still have not fully taken aboard in terms of undermining the legitimacy of the existing globalized liberal world order, and it has resulted as it has in his election. If you go to Europe, you have, I think, a similar kind of institutional failure. There, I would point to two in particular institutions that were very badly constructed. The first is obviously the euro. I don't have to go into this in front of this crowd. It has not been solved. The underlying problem of the euro has not been solved. The fact that you have a monetary union without a unified fiscal policy, they've simply swept it under the carpet. They've gotten all the Greek debt off of the books of the French and German banks and onto the ECB's books, and that for the time being solves the political problem, but the underlying poorly conceived construction has not been fixed. The other problem is the Schengen system of free internal immigration within the European Union. The fact of the matter is that you cannot have a system of free internal migration if you do not have secure outer borders. This is what the Syrian refugee crisis demonstrated to everybody. It's been hard for Europeans to deal with this because the only people making this point are people like Viktor Orban, these very illiberal populist nationalists, because in a certain sense there's a high degree of political correctness in the EU itself, but it is absolutely correct. You cannot have free movement on the inside if there's not a way of controlling the outer borders. And this is another problem that the leadership of the EU, and in particularly the Germans, have simply failed to address. If I were a German chancellor, if I were Angela Merkel, I would be spending a lot of money buying Coast Guard cutters for Greece and Italy, but that is really not happening as we speak. And so again, there are some deep underlying policy mistakes that were made by elites in Europe that I think explain the nature of the Brexit vote. And there again, there's a very common sociology. In Brexit, as in the Trump election in the United States, the same sorts of people demographically or sociologically ended up voting for these anti-establishment candidates. They were all more rural, less educated, older, white voters. These were the people that were being left behind by globalization. Now, this is a phenomenon that reaches, I think, well beyond Europe, because you have been seeing the rise of populist nationalists in other parts of the world as well. In Russia, under Vladimir Putin, in Hungary, under Viktor Orban, in Poland, with the new Kaczynski government, and in Turkey, under President Erdogan. In, again, every single one of these cases, you face a very similar kind of sociology. Vladimir Putin has not been popular among educated, more cosmopolitan urban elites in Russia. He is not popular in St. Petersburg or Moscow. He is popular in smaller cities and in rural areas of Russia. That is really his support base. The same thing is true of Erdogan. He's not popular in Istanbul and Ankara, in those urban centers. Viktor Orban is very unpopular in Budapest. But again, all of them are relying on, in a sense, these older, more rural, less educated populations that in many of those countries actually constitute a majority of the population. What's happening, I think, broadly is the following, that a modern liberal democracy is actually a combination of two somewhat discordant institutions. There's the democratic side, which has to do with voting and popular choice of leaders. And then there's the liberal choice, the liberal part, which has to do with the rule of law, which are rules that constrain power. And in all of these cases, in Russia, in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, increasingly in Britain, and in the United States itself, the democratic part is turning against the liberal part. That is to say, you're getting democratic majorities, elected democratic majorities, or at least pluralities, that have enough political power to then start eroding the liberal rules that have bound power in those societies. And the balance between democracy and liberalism has been tilting away from the liberalism. The first point of attack is the liberal international system, which, you know, I think is very clear is really the target. I mean, people say that Donald Trump does not have clear ideas. I mean, it's true that he does not have clear ideas on very many subjects, except for the fact that he has been a consistent nationalist his whole life, particularly an economic nationalist. He's been saying the same thing, criticizing countries that run trade surpluses with the United States ever since the 1970s. It's absolutely consistent in his rhetoric, and as both a candidate and I think as president, he's been perfectly happy to erode any kind of rule, any kind of institutional rule that has stood in the way of what he wanted to accomplish, whether that is a contractor that he owed money to when he was building one of his casinos. He'd forced them to sue him in order to get their money. And I think you're seeing it now in his attacks on various types of American institutions. The Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the intelligence community, now the entire mainstream press. As long as it does not suit his interests, he's perfectly happy to use the power of the tweet to undermine it. I think in the panel discussion, we'll probably get into a longer discussion about what this means in terms of social media and the nature of our electronically mediated, the way we talk to each other, because I think that also will have grave consequences for the nature of modern democracy and certainly modern commerce. Let me finish up by saying a little bit about what to expect. Ever since the election, I've been doing this a lot, speaking to non-American audiences about what to expect from this new administration. And I must say, although we are now, I don't know, whatever it is, 6 weeks into this administration, I'm not sure that I have a better sense. And I would say that for the following reason. Let's just begin with foreign policy. If you look at the people that Trump has finally ended up with to run for American foreign policy, it's not bad. James Mattis is a very accomplished, very, I think, responsible Secretary of Defense. The new National Security Advisor, H.K. McMaster, is a wonderful officer who I think understands this region from his own experience here. Rex Tillerson, I suspect, is, I mean, it's funny because he's not had a voice as Secretary of State, which is a little bit strange. He does not seem to be cut in on a lot of foreign policy issues, but from what I can see of his background, he should be good. Nikki Haley in the United Nations has said, I think, a lot of responsible things about American allies and the like. The only problem is that they seem to have nothing to do with the agenda that's been outlined by Donald Trump, by President Donald Trump and his close advisor, Steve Bannon. I would recommend to all of you highly to go and look at the speech that Bannon gave to the Vatican a couple of years ago, which is, it's quite revealing because it's first of all, it's a very intelligent speech, and I would say that I probably agree with about half of it. He complains about crony capitalism, about the way that the financial crisis illustrates the way that the financial sector had corrupted American politics and regulation in many ways at the expense of ordinary Americans. He made exactly the point that I just made about the unfair distributive impacts of globalization and other kinds of policies, but then he ends up going off the rails in other areas, so that, for example, he doesn't feel that we're simply fighting extremist jihadists represented by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He seems to think that we are involved in a much larger civilizational struggle in which it is the entire Judeo-Christian tradition and civilization that is being challenged by Islam as a whole, which obviously leads to very different conclusions for how you treat things like immigration and the war on terrorism and the like. And then he complains about the bailouts, but doesn't seem to have any good solution to the fact that we had systemically important financial institutions in 2008 that were about to collapse. He simply would have let his own bank, Goldman Sachs, collapse under those circumstances. And so I think we're in a very unstable situation right now. You cannot have a relatively normal foreign policy team trying to execute a policy that has a lot of continuity with the policies we've had in the past, and yet have a president and his chief advisor that have extremely different ideas. At a certain point, I think the hope has been that everybody's simply going to ignore Donald Trump's tweets, and that these professionals will carry on and run the actual day-to-day policy. I hope that that would be the case, but I really doubt it. I really doubt it, because at a certain point I do think ideas matter, and I do think it matters who's president of the United States. And so as you think about the implications, and I know we'll get into more of this in the panel discussion, how this plays out with the obviously big issues that you have to face in this region, I'm afraid to tell you I think there's still going to be a lot of uncertainty, because I can see American policy going in a relatively predictable direction. On the other hand, I can see it going completely off the rails. So thank you very much for your attention. And
Frank,
good.
why don't
Stay
you
here? Okay.
join me here?